New guidelines that could affect you. The National Wages Council says companies may implement wage cuts to save jobs.
Prices rise as demand goes up. Airfares to Hong Kong jump after Singapore announced plans for a travel bubble with the city.
And calling for change, thousands of young people in Thailand defy the authorities to participate in protests.
Happy Friday, everyone. You're watching The Big Story, coming to you live from the Straits Times newsroom. I'm Olivia Quay.
And I'm Dylan Ang. You can subscribe to the Straits Times channel so you never miss a single episode.
Let's begin with the new guidelines on wages and retrenchment for employers in Singapore.
The National Wages Council updated its recommendations today after convening for a second time this year due to the challenging circumstances brought about by COVID-19.
Among the guidelines issued, employers may implement temporary wage cuts after other measures have been exhausted. Senior management should take earlier and deeper wage cuts. For low-wage workers earning a basic monthly salary of up to $1,400, employers should implement a wage freeze instead of a wage cut. Here's Council Chairman Peter Seah.
So one of the major calls is that retrenchment only when necessary. And you will see from our guidelines that a lot of details have been put in to help guide the issue of wage cuts, the issue of retrenchments. And it's really about creating a balance where beyond other cost cuts, wage cuts are necessary for not only for companies to get through the crisis, but also to minimize the retrenchments.
Here to help make sense of this is Assistant News Editor To Yong Chuan. Hey Yong Chuan, now what do you think of these updates? Will it help or hurt employers?
So the main recommendation today is that companies can cut wages temporarily to the extent that they are needed to save jobs. Of course, from the workers' perspective, any wage cut can be painful. But if you take a longer-term perspective, the National Wages Council say that companies can cut wages only to the extent of saving jobs. It's temporary. Low-wage workers will have their wages frozen rather than cut. So it can minimize some pain for workers in the short run. In the long run, if these moves are effective, the short-term pain that the workers bear in the wage cut can pay off in the long run. If the companies are able to survive this pandemic, keep the business intact, the jobs are intact, then it will benefit workers in the sense that they will be able to keep their jobs. At the same time, the council also said that companies should restore these cuts when business recovers, when the economy recovers. Now, this also means that the pain that the workers feel will be short-term. When the economy recovers, they will have their cuts restored.
Well, Yong Chuan, these are guidelines after all. Are the companies under any pressure to actually abide by these guidelines?
To answer this question, I've got to explain how the National Wages Council works. It is a national body comprising of the three-way partnership of the Ministry of Manpower, the National Trades Union Congress, and the Singapore National Employers Federation. Now, there's no law that says companies in Singapore must follow these guidelines. But the council has been around for many years. There's a very strong degree of moral suasion to make sure that the recommendations are implemented and followed. Of course, you have the unions being represented in the council, and the unions in the unionized companies will make sure that not just the details, the recommendations are implemented, but the spirit as well. For example, the spirit of senior management bearing a deeper cut, the spirit that these cuts are temporarily, has to be restored when the economy recovers. So in that sense, even though there is no law that says companies must follow, the record has been very positive. And companies do follow in the sense that the spirit and the details are both implemented in the way the council recommended.
I guess this links to a very similar question, which is how is the council actually going to monitor whether or not companies actually implement pay cuts prudently and temporarily to actually save jobs?
I think that there are several channels. Of course, for one, the implementation will be monitored by unions in the unionized companies. The unions will make sure that when these recommendations kick in, the companies do not abuse them by using as excuse to cut costs when they do not need to. So union at one level of check. Besides unions, of course, there's the Ministry of Manpower. Currently, the Manpower Ministry requires companies to notify the ministry when they retrench workers. When these retrenchment notices are received, of course, the ministry can scrutinize company and how was the retrenchment carried out? Were there wage cuts before? And through such monitoring by union and by the Manpower Ministry, we can ensure that there's no abuse by companies. Of course, members of the public who work for companies that are not unionized, there's nothing stopping them from complaining and bringing problems to the attention of MOM. And that's how it can be monitored and implemented.
Right, Yong Chuan, several measures announced today, but what else can the council do if the wage cuts are not enough to save jobs, especially if the COVID-19 pandemic drags on?
Now, the measures today are major because it is very rare for the NWC to recommend wage cuts. So if you play competitive sports, this is equivalent of what I call a Hail Mary, right? You throw the ball and you pray. But thankfully, we are not there yet. If these wage cuts are not enough to save jobs or save enough jobs, there's still one more move left for the NWC. And in fact, NWC recommended it once before in the 1998 Asian financial crisis. I'm referring to CPF cuts. So the CPF and wage are two things that can be cut. Now this time round, the council made it clear that it is only recommending wage cuts, but not CPF cuts. Now this is a wise move because any cut to the CPF contribution rates will affect retirement savings, and it will come back and haunt the worker and the country in the long run because they won't be able to save enough for retirement. So the council said it decided not to make this move. And that is our Hail Mary, but we are not there yet. So we are not out of moves, and we still have some capacity where we can overcome this current crisis.
Right. Well, thank you so much, Yong Chuan. We've been speaking to To Yong Chuan, Assistant News Editor at the Straits Times.
An update on the COVID-19 situation here. No cases in the community among the 9 new infections confirmed today.
Well, today's count, though, includes 1 case in a dormitory and 8 imported. The Health Ministry will share more details later tonight.
A man and woman linked to a series of thefts of Budget 2020 grocery vouchers from HDB letterboxes have been charged. Mikhail Wayudin Abdullah was charged with 3 counts of theft, while Awani Nur Amira Azami was charged with 2 counts of theft. Both stand accused of stealing 15 grocery vouchers valued at $10 each from the letterboxes of 2 victims. The amount allegedly stolen totaled $300.
Corporate and individual taxpayers contributed more to the government's coffers in the past financial year, but analysts cautioned that the pace could slow down on the back of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Inland Revenue Authority of Singapore collected $53.5 billion in taxes in the fiscal year 2019-2020, 2.1% more than a year earlier. Now, IRS's collection accounted for 72% of government operating revenue, and this amount represented 10.5% of Singapore's GDP or economic output.
Singapore's public service is set to revamp how its officers are assessed. This in response to industry disruptions and the challenges brought on by the pandemic. Speaking at the virtual public service observance ceremony, part of the annual Public Service Week, Minister in charge of the Public Service, Chan Chun Sing, noted the need to update the currently estimated potential system, adding that the career roadmap for officers should be for the next 3 to 5 years and not the next 30 years. Senior public service officers too should gain exposure to policy, operations and communications or mobilization work. They should also have stints outside the public service in the people and private sectors.
While also present at the ceremony was Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong, who thanked public officers for their work during the COVID-19 pandemic. He also acknowledged shortcomings in the government's response and expressed gratitude for their dedication.
We fought off the virus, kept our people safe, and took care of workers and families. Public officers have put in your heart and soul and given it everything you have. Without high-quality, dedicated public officials, we wouldn't have stood a chance. This Public Service Week, I salute all our public officers for your dedication and efforts. Thank you for what you have done and continue to do. The fight is not over, our battle continues. But together, we will overcome.
The cost of air tickets between Singapore and Hong Kong jumped within 24 hours of the two sides unveiling plans for a travel bubble, even for leisure purposes that wouldn't require people to quarantine upon arrival.
According to the Singapore Airlines website, the cheapest price for a return economy seat to Hong Kong was $558 this morning up until the end of December versus around $400 yesterday afternoon when the travel bubble was announced.
While details are still being worked out, people could be travelling between both places in several weeks. Now, before we all pack our bags, here are still some commonly asked questions that we should help answer.
That's right. Well, first up, how is this travel bubble different from the other schemes in place? Well, air travel bubbles are for general travellers and have no requirements for a controlled itinerary. There will also be no restrictions for purpose of travel.
Now, who can apply to travel to Hong Kong as long as you stayed in 14 days in either country, regardless of age and nationality? You're eligible. But Transport Minister Ong Ye Kung has said the only exception so far, at the request of Hong Kong, are the foreign workers living in dorms in Singapore. There will be a quota, though, on the number of flights plying both sides, but neither has revealed specific numbers.
And perhaps the bigger question is, when will flights be launched and how much will they cost? Well, no details of the launch date or prices yet, unfortunately, although ticket prices to Hong Kong, as we've mentioned, have risen.
Remember to also factor in the cost of the PCR test because travellers have to first test negative for COVID-19. The Straits Times previously reported that the PCR test costs $186. Now visit straitstimes.com to read more details on this air travel bubble. In Thailand, anti-government protesters plan to defy a ban on gatherings in Bangkok for a third day and hold rallies across the country. That could potentially escalate the three-month movement in support of monarchy reform and greater democracy.
Well, thousands of protesters demanding the resignation of Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha yesterday, and they're set to stage another demonstration later today.
Mr. Prayut said he will not resign and that the ban on political gatherings would last up to 30 days.
Well, the Straits Times' Indo-China Bureau Chief Tan Hui-yi joins us now to share more from Bangkok. So, Hui-yi, these protests are led by students and other young people. Most protest leaders are in their 20s and an even younger generation is following these protests. What factors are influencing them and what do they want?
Well, last night they gathered in central Bangkok to demand the government release some protest leaders who have been arrested and denied bail. But there are broader demands. They want a new constitution, they want fresh elections, and they want the government to stop harassing its critics. They also want to limit the powers of the king to keep them in line with his status as a constitutional monarch. That is the most controversial demand. Before this, the monarchy was still considered an untouchable topic in Thailand. It is against the law, for example, to insult the king or the queen. The King Maha Vajiralongkorn took ownership of the Crown Property Bureau's assets 2 years ago, and he personally controls 2 army units. Before he signed the current constitution, he had asked for it to be amended. Now, what's interesting about these protesters, which was very clear during last night's rally, is that more and more of them are coming from high schools. These 14, 15-year-old students are turning up in their school uniforms, and they are mobilizing support from their peers across the country.
Now, do you see the government meeting these demands? And, if not, is there a compromise or a sort of middle ground that will appease both sides?
Well, that's still a big question. Just this morning, Prime Minister Prayut Chan-o-cha confirmed that he was not stepping down. He also asked for cooperation to maintain peace and order in Thailand. The government, as you know, has declared a serious emergency in Bangkok, which has basically made these protests illegal. The decree gives security officers broad powers to detain suspects and censor news. And the government says this is necessary to prevent confrontation between groups with different political opinions.
Yep.
A compromise could be reached in terms of some amendment to the constitution, which was drafted under the previous military government. However, during a parliament sitting last month, several senators opposed any change to this charter. They voted with lawmakers from the coalition government for more time to consider this matter. They will reconvene in parliament next month. So it remains to be seen if there will be some progress on this front.
Right. Well, tens of thousands of protesters in the streets of central Bangkok. So are you expecting the situation to escalate or, calm down later tonight and over the weekend? And actually, are there any indications that the protests could actually turn violent?
That's hard to say. So far, the protesters have been able to mobilize large numbers using social media in a matter of hours. Last night's rally in Ratchaprasong, for example, drew thousands of people, partly because of the detention of key protest leaders, which made them angry. I don't think the protests are going to stop, though the tactics may change. There have been some brief scuffles. The rallies have largely been peaceful. The protest leaders constantly remind supporters not to be violent, and the police have also been restrained. What we are seeing are largely flash mobs that last for a few hours, rather than prolonged sit-ins that were common in the past. But there is a risk of confrontation between these protesters and royalists, who are starting to mobilize their supporters to protect the monarchy.
Well, thanks very much for coming on the show, Hui Yi. Of course, we'll be checking in as this story develops, and that was our Indochina Bureau Chief, Tan Hui Yi. In other global news, US President Donald Trump and Democratic presidential candidate Joe Biden faced off at two separate but simultaneous town halls. Both were grilled on various topics, including those they had previously skirted. Mr. Trump was confronted with his administration's handling of the pandemic, as well as his stance on white supremacy. For Mr. Biden, those topics included his stand on fracking and controversial comments on the black community.
Meanwhile, Mr. Biden's running mate Kamala Harris cancelled her travel plans after one of her staff members tested positive for COVID-19. Ms. Harris said she wasn't in close contact with a staff member in the 2 days leading up to the diagnosis and had 2 negative tests this week. Reports said she would hold virtual fundraisers for now and be back to in-person campaigning on Monday.
In coronavirus news, Indonesia took over the Philippines as Southeast Asia's new pandemic hotspot. With over 4,400 new cases in the past 24 hours, the world's 4th most populous nation tally hit more than 349,000 on Thursday. There have been around 12,200 deaths, also the highest in the region.
The Philippines has lifted a ban on non-essential overseas travel. Filipinos can travel out of the country as long as they have negative antigen test results, confirmed plane tickets and health and travel insurance. This will kick in from October 21st.
In sports, according to Italy's sports minister, Cristiano Ronaldo may have violated the country's coronavirus measures by returning to Turin from Portugal 2 days after he tested positive for the coronavirus. Ronaldo risks a fine after joining his national side last week, despite Juventus being in isolation after 2 staff members tested positive.
7-time MotoGP champion Valentino Rossi is the latest high-profile athlete to test positive for the coronavirus, meaning he will miss this weekend's Grand Prix of Aragon. Rossi, in his final season with Yamaha, is currently 13th in the standings.
Time to kickstart the weekend, and if you haven't watched it yet, check out our new live weekend picks, where our colleagues at Live share their picks on what you can do over the weekend. If you're watching us on YouTube, there's a link in the description below.
Well, these picks range from films to festivals, dining to drinks, so you can definitely get some ideas on what to do this weekend before you start the new work week.
I'm Dylan Ang with Olivia Quay. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on Monday.